In today's age, the terms sort of cancel culture and wokeness are very common phrases that are used. They spark intense public debate. And some people, they use these terms to describe accountability. Others use them to describe silencing or create social pressure or what we would call ideological rigidity. Regardless of how you sort of define that, both of these concepts deal with how societies respond to people who challenge norms, expose injustice, and essentially disrupt the status quo. And what's fascinating and often overlooked is that the ministry of Jesus Christ unfolded within a social world of its time that had its own versions of these dynamics. Jesus's teachings, they did not emerge into sort of like an empty, neutral space. They confronted entrenched institutions, cultural expectations, and very powerful authorities. And in doing so, he experienced the ancient equivalent of cancellation, reputation assault, and sort of this ideological backlash. So I want to talk just a little bit before we dive into Genesis today on sort of how the dynamics that we associate today when we think of cancel culture and wokeness can be used and understood carefully and responsibly as very sort of interpretive tools of understanding Jesus' ministries and the reactions to it. In order to do that, and before we can apply that lens to the life of Jesus, we need some sort of working definitions, right? So when we look at, well, what is cancel culture? Cancel culture is a social process where individuals or groups attempt to discredit, silence, marginalize, or punish someone whose views or actions violate what would be the perceived norms or values. Now, it can function as a tool of social accountability or a tool of social exclusion. Okay. And when we look at the word wokeness, if you separate the word wokeness from sort of its politicized usage, the core idea really refers to being attuned to injustice, being critically aware of power structures, and advocating for marginalized and oppressed people. And very interestingly, these two concepts, they conflict in some ways and they overlap in others. One seeks accountability for harm, the other seeks justice for the oppressed, and both can sort of be misused and both can provoke a backlash. But these dynamics, accountability versus backlash, were very, very much alive in sort of the first century Judea. Now, Jesus Christ was a radical disruptor of the religious status quo. He was not crucified simply because he preached love. He was crucified because his message disrupted systems of power, those being sort of religious, social, and political. So let's take a very brief look at how that sort of looked. First of all, he challenged entrenched religious authorities. Jesus openly confronted the Pharisees' legalism, the Sadducees' temple power, the scribes' monopoly over interpretation, and the broader religious establishment at large. In Matthew 23, Jesus delivers seven woes directly against religious leaders. And this was not a sort of gentle critique. It was essentially a systematic exposure of corruption, hypocrisy, and spiritual blindness. So, in modern terms, essentially, he was calling out the power structures that protected those people under the guise of religious purity. But he not only did that, is he inverted social hierarchies. Jesus intentionally elevated the poor, the sick, women, Samaritans, tax collectors, prostitutes, and the ritually unclean. So this was, in essence, at the time, a radical social reordering. And a deeply woke message, sort of in the ancient sense, is he was bringing awareness to oppression, marginalization, and forgotten humanity. And not only did he do that, but he redefined righteousness outside of the institutional control. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus teaches that righteousness is not about rule keeping, but about inner transformation. And by doing that, he undercut the religious elite's entire system of authority. So when you challenge the foundation of a system, the system is going to respond. And how did they respond? Well, first of all, and we can even see this today. If you apply someone that is sort of rocking the boat, sort of, so to speak, you're going to see this as today, and this is exactly what happened to Jesus. Step one, attempts to publicly discredit him. So we've got the religious leaders, they accused him of blasphemy. Others claimed that he was demon possessed. Some argued he was a political threat to Rome. Rumors were spread to undermine his credibility. And this is what we call classic cancel culture behaviors. Does it sound familiar? Discredit the messenger so that the message loses power. That was step one. Step two, they attempt to shame him socially. So Jesus was mocked for dining with sinners. He was ridiculed for breaking Sabbath expectations, questioned publicly in attempts to trap him, and he was accused of actually violating purity laws. And these were attempts to push him outside of what the sort of acceptable societal bounds were. And that moves us into step three. And what is step three? Step three is coordinated institutional suppression. So we've got multiple factions at play here. We've got the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, the Herodians, who normally disagreed with each other. They were all united in opposition to Jesus. And this was not a few critics on the fringe. This was the systematic institutional effort to silence a disruptive voice. And then the fourth one, the final cancellation, it was the execution. I mean, the crucifixion was the ultimate form of silencing, erasure, social annihilation, and it was intended to eliminate both the person and the ideas that they represented. But as history shows, it failed. So when we think about Jesus, one of the things that we don't necessarily think about Jesus as being is woke in the definition of wokeness, because what did he do? He brought awareness to injustice. Think of the cleansing of the temple or his confrontation of this sort of exploitive religious systems and his protection of the vulnerable. And he also addressed structural inequalities. His parables repeatedly, they would condemn greed, exploitation, and this sort of indifference towards suffering. And he emphasized that God stands with the oppressed. The last shall be first. And something else that fits that sort of frame is that he raised the dignity of the marginalized groups. In an era where women had no social power, Jesus taught them, he affirmed them, he counted them amongst his disciples, and he revealed himself first to women after the resurrection. And that in itself was very socially shocking. And he also defied cultural narratives of who is worthy. So essentially, the parable of the Good Samaritan is essentially a critique of ethnic prejudice and tribalism. Jesus was raising consciousness, awakening people to injustice long before this modern word sort of woke existed. And when we look at, well, why did the religious authorities try to cancel him to begin with? Because, number one, Jesus threatened their theological authority. He reinterpreted scripture in ways that bypassed what that institutional control was. B, their economic interests. The temple establishment profited from sacrifice, ritual, and the sort of the taxation structures of that time. And their political stability. A charismatic teacher with a massive following was seen as risking a backlash from the Roman government at that time. Their social hierarchy. Jesus dismantled the notion that holiness belonged to the elite. He did not fit that mold, and they tried to break him for that. So the ultimate lesson that we learn here that was prevalent even in the times where Jesus walked on this earth is that truth is not always welcome. But Jesus shows us something timeless, and that is when someone shines light on injustice, challenges entrenched systems, calls out hypocrisy, or lifts up the oppressed, The response is often hostility, distortion, and attempts to silence that person. But we know that his life also showed that truth has resilience, compassion has power, and justice has memory. So attempts to cancel what is righteous will ultimately fail.